Hi, my name is Barbara Taylor. About 40 years ago, it was Barbara Kelpin. That was before I married my husband, Stephen. So let me take you back into my past, and you can meet the people who helped shape my life. Since most of my ancestors have passed on, I had to get in touch with a few cousins in order to fill in some of the gaps. So let us start with my father's side. The Kelpins came over from Schwerin, Mecklenburg-Schwerin, Germany. My great-great-grandmother and great-great-grandfather, Fred and Minnie Kelpin, came over in 1880 through Ellis Island, and they lived in New York City and area for around 3 years. And then my great-grandfather, Fred, decided to move his family to Wisconsin to try their hand at farming. His father had passed away while they were in New York City, so his mother went with them to Wisconsin. They had had 2 children in New York City, and then after they moved to Heathville, Wisconsin, they had 5 more children. My grandfather, Rudy, was their youngest son and 5th child. After a few years there, Great-Grandpa Kelpin decided to sell the farm and get into the saloon business. That did not turn out so well, so by 1900 he packed up the family again. This time they moved to Mayville, Wisconsin, about 50 miles away, where he went to work in the lumber business. All reports were that he was a hard worker and very well liked. My great-grandmother, Minnie, was a midwife, practical nurse, and delivered most of the babies in the area. They said she also was known for her great German cooking, especially her strudel. My great-great-grandmother that made her home with her son Fred lived and pretty much stayed at home most of the time. She spoke and had the family only speak German at home. The children did attend German and English schools so that they could learn English as well. And then around 1914, one of the older girls that had married and moved to Orth, Minnesota, wrote back to her parents and told them of the plentiful and cheap land there. So my great-grandfather packed up the family again, and they all moved there to Orth, Minnesota. And there is where my grandfather, Rudy, met my grandmother, Frances Slace, and they were married in 1916. My father was born in 1918, and his sister in 1920. My grandmother and grandfather were divorced early on, so I never met him, and most of the people in the family weren't real fond of him, so he just never was included in anything. He passed away in the 60s, and my grandma Kelpin had moved out to Washington State by then, but she did come and visit us every summer. She never really picked up on the German part. She was pretty much more into the English, so my dad and his sister were never really taught much as far as the German language and that, other than what they picked up on their own and that from other ancestors. Now, my mother's side, this was the Clayson sign. It seemed this one was even harder to find information about, but I did find that my great-great-grandparents, the Claysons, came over here from Germany, not sure what part. They settled in Lincoln, Nebraska area, and my great-grandfather, Frederick Clayson, was born in the early 1840s, and he married my great-grandmother, Anna Barbara Rodenberg, in 1888, and they had 8 children. And then I know that the 4th was my grandfather, Fred, and he was born in 1893. And when he was about 6 years old, his father died. Then his mother, being a widow, farmed out the older children for income, so that my grandfather never talked about his past. He was very bitter about it all. And so in the process of this, he ended up in southern Minnesota, where he met my grandmother, Florence Clayson, in 1922, and then they ended up moving up to northern Minnesota. And my mother was the oldest, Adelaide, and then she had excuse me, 6 younger brothers and sisters. And then when she got out of school, she took with some friends. They decided to go to out west to the lodges, and that is where she spent most of her time, to the big ski lodges and that out in Montana and Wyoming, Glacier National Park and Yellowstone National Park. And she only came home for very short breaks because she really loved it out there. But then she came back. She did come back in the late 20s, when she was in her late 20s, back to her hometown of North Home. And then she was helped run one of the local cafes in town, and not knowing that the woman that owned it, that her nephew was my dad. They met and courted for about a year, and then they were married in July of 1950. Shortly after that, my parents decided to move out to Montana. It seemed like that's where the work was. My father worked various jobs out there, from woodcutter to rancher, prison guard, and my mother was a nurse's aide, and then eventually turned to her passion of cooking and running restaurants. We traveled a lot when we were out there and seen a lot of wonderful scenery. And there was 3 of us children: my older brother Greg, me, and then my younger brother Reggie, who passed away this last year. And then when I was about 8 years old, we moved back to Minnesota, where my father was a groundskeeper for a very large hospital, and my mom went back into running restaurants. My relatives from both sides visited. It seemed like we visited them more than they visited us, but we were there quite a bit with them, intermingled through the summers especially. On my mom's side, her mom spoke German, and she kept it up, and it was very fortunate. When I was in high school, I took 2 years of it, so when I'd go to visit her, she liked to speak German, and she would have me speak German, and she would challenge me in German words and things. So I was making sure I brought my trusty little German dictionary along, so in case I got stuck. Now, my grandparents all passed away in the 60s, and my father passed away in the early 70s, and the rest of them passed away in the middle 90s. So I only have about 8 cousins left on my dad's side, and my mom's side 5. There's 5 of us cousins. I still have my older brother, and he doesn't speak any English at all, and German at all. And my younger brother did know a few language. In fact, he lived in Bernie, where he was learning to pick up the language again, which is spoken up there off and on in a lot of the households. So most of the history I have been put together. I'm doing this for my daughter, because my son is really not interested in this family, old family stuff, and they know that my grandma is now in her 60s, so it's important that we get as much down as possible. I would always love to go back and learn the language again, pick up where I left off, and kind of keep it going. And the one thing that was funny was, in my family, there was no teachers. Either side of the family, although the women were all very avid readers, so I guess that's where I get my love of books. And that is my story. Thank you.